Hello, my name is Southey, and you're tuning in to our webinar today on interview skills. So thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you over the next hour about how to prepare for interviews, common questions, and how to follow up after interviews. Certainly, I encourage you over the course of the presentation that as you have questions or comments that you think are maybe helpful for others to have answered, please do type them in. Relevant comments as well. Certainly, if you've got some experiences and perspectives that relate, please do feel free to type in and share, and we will get to them as we can. A big thank you to Autism Ontario for hosting this webinar. It is the fourth in a series of 5. Next week will be on being social at work, and we'll be going through a bunch of scenarios. It's on Monday, same time, same place. So if you're interested in that, please do register. And if you hear me referencing any of the past webinars, they are all available online. So you might hear some information about referencing pieces that I've done in the last month as part of this webinar series. So certainly they are available to check out if you haven't had the chance to yet. Okay, so we're going to get into it, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Redpath Center, because the Redpath Center is the organization that I work in affiliation with, and it specializes in supporting individuals with autism spectrum disorder and other related conditions across the lifespan, so children straight through to seniors. And we have a few psychologists there, as well as there's a speech therapist, and then there's a number of other therapists that provide different kind of coaching, as well as psychotherapy, counseling for all different ages, for families, individuals, and couples. And the main office is located downtown Toronto at Yonge and Eglinton. However, there are affiliates throughout the province and even one affiliate in BC. So certainly there are ways to get in touch locally. And right now, a lot of my colleagues are providing digital platforms for their work. So if you're looking for support that way, then certainly you can get in touch. Most of the services there, though, are fee for service. So just be mindful of that. Okay, so a little bit about me and why I'm talking to you about interview skills. So I started doing workshops on interview skills probably a little bit over a decade ago when I used to work at the John Howard Society, and I did employment counseling there for youth that were at high-risk youth. So they may have had criminal records, or they may have had issues with finishing high school, different learning disabilities, that sort of thing. And I worked there and did a bunch of employment counseling. And then I did a master's in social work and really studied autism spectrum disorder at that time. And for the last decade or so, I took those two interests and tied them together. And primarily, I do counseling for individuals who may have anxiety issues, issues with social relationships, primarily people on the spectrum. And then the other big bulk of the work I do is what I'm doing today, talking to you about employment. Okay. So just going to get into a little bit. Hold on. Sorry, one moment. I flipped ahead too far. Let me just go back. Okay, there we go. Agenda is where we're going to start. That makes a little more sense, I think. So what we're going to talk about today, as I mentioned, is how to prepare for an interview. Oh, interview accommodations. That's a really big thing we're going to talk about because some of you may be going into interviews and be requesting accommodations in advance. So that would be if you had decided to disclose and you wanted some accommodations early on, then that would be one of the topics that we'll cover and how to go about doing that. And then we're going to look at different types of interview questions and what the interviewer might be looking for you to respond to, and most common interview questions and answers. So just to kind of warm me up a little bit, feelings about interviews. So it's very, very normal to feel anxious or nervous when you're having an interview. That's very common for most people, neurotypical and those on the spectrum. Primarily individuals who living with ASD, autistics, are more likely to feel potentially nervous or anxious. It may draw out some social anxiety, more than a healthy average amount of anxiety in an interview, because the level of social communication required in that kind of environment is different and than a regular communication. So it's really difficult to have the opportunity to do a ton of interviews, right? We're not doing them super frequently. We're only doing them between jobs. So it's not a practice that you can get into all that frequently. So because it's not a typical communication, for some, that can really spike anxiety or nerves. However, we're going to talk about ways to be most prepared for that today. Practicing interview skills is a great way to work through some of that, as well as on the other side, getting some, not exact scripting. I would never encourage anyone to memorize word for word, because I've seen way too many people do it. And then when they forget a word, they kind of forget the whole thing that they were trying to say. But we'll talk about how to kind of get some loose scripting, some keywords that you want to remember, so that probably you'll be able to feel a little bit more prepared. And then on the flip side, I must say also that I have met with a number of people who actually do better in interviews than they do in typical social communications. So it's important to think about that too, that maybe because it's so structured, the interview, you know that the expectation is that the interviewer would be asking the interviewee a question. And it's not that casual small talk back and forth where you're trying to establish common interests, but you're really just meant to answer their question. Perhaps for some, that can also work in the opposite way. It might make someone more comfortable or relieved in that communication, knowing that it's very clear expectations and boundaries of how to approach that communication. Okay, so how do you prepare for an interview? That's the first thing. And it's really worth mentioning, because I certainly have had people not get jobs and mix up their opportunity to interview because of their lack of preparedness around the executive functioning side of things. So by that, I mean the logistical pieces. So right now we know that we're not actually probably going to any interviews in person at the moment because of physical distancing protocols. However, in regular kind of more typical days that are hopefully in the near future, a good practice would always be to test run the route to get to the interview. And even though we are working remotely and digitally at the moment, certainly I have had a handful of clients and people that I know who are in interview stages with jobs that they're interested in, and their interviews are online. And so for situations where your interview is online, then it's important to also test the method of communication you'll be using. So let's say that it's Zoom, making sure that you've got the web link and you've got maybe the password if it does require a password, making sure that your speakers are set up in advance, making sure that you're feeling as calm and comfortable with the technology that you're using to interview as possible. And then, like I said, in the later days, when we're hopefully back to a more typical society where we're able to see others in person, test running the route is really important, and always giving yourself some extra time. Factoring in things like traffic is really important. Factoring in things like preparing to bring maybe some water with you, or making sure that you've had a meal beforehand. Making sure that you've given yourself enough time to do that extra prep in the morning that you might need to do to stand out a little bit more in an interview that you might not do on a regular day. So you'll see in the slide here, I say dress to impress. So a statistic I've heard many times is that you want to look about 10% better than you would usually be required for dressing on a regular day for that work environment. So that would mean that you would be dressing up a little bit more than you would usually for in that environment. So making sure that you have the clothes, making sure that you have the shoes, making sure that if they're a pair of nice shoes that you don't wear that often because you're more a sneakers and track pant kind of person on a day-to-day basis, making sure that you know where those items are is really important, because as I mentioned in the last slide, I think it was the last slide, I mentioned that for a lot of people, particularly autistics, their stress is going to be higher on the interview day. So we want to make sure that any factor that would make it even higher than usual, we're going to try to minimize, we're going to try to reduce, we're going to try to be as prepared as possible. I already mentioned don't memorize the responses to the questions. Grooming is important. We want to make sure that that your hair is washed, that you're potentially clean shaven, depending on the industry, depending on a few circumstances. I know one of my clients right now is really enjoying and experimenting with some pink hair, and that's really great for the moment. And she's doing that because she is in isolation and has some great access to box dye. But when it's back to her looking for work in a few weeks or months, she's going to make sure that she doesn't have the really strong pinks in her hair, because she typically is applying for office jobs with the government. And so until she gets into her next job, that's when she would kind of test out the appropriateness of that workplace culture to see if that's okay or not okay, because some places may be more conservative. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong to have pink hair by any means, but I am saying that different workplace cultures may have different protocols around dress and appearance. And so you want to make sure that you are keeping your options open by being mindful of that. And then another thing that's important to do is Google common interview questions for your individual industry. Okay, so we're going to be talking about general interview questions and answers today, but I'm not getting into any specific industry. So we know that in the IT industry, there's a lot of very technical questions. You could even, if you're applying for a programming job with a certain kind of software, then you might even want to be Googling the interview questions and that software name, right? The more specific, the better. There are tremendous resources online with questions and answers. And so I'd say look at a few, see what kind of information you're finding. And so there could be some helpful pieces there. And then I say use positive self-talk prior and visualize success. As I mentioned many times now, it can be very anxiety provoking. So trying to visualize yourself walking through with the most success possible, imagining showing up and being calm and relaxed and, making some eye contact with your interviewer or close to eye contact with your interviewee, depending on your comfort, but imagining what a successful interview would look like for you. And of course, remember to demonstrate professionalism at the interview. Okay. So before I get into too much detail about accommodations for the interview, I first need to make a note on disclosure, because that's really the kind of underlying piece that comes before deciding if you're going to have accommodations. So I had mentioned in a webinar from a couple of weeks ago that was on disclosure, job searching, and being social at work. That webinar is available online, so you may want to look into checking that out if you have more specific questions about disclosure or are looking for more resources on disclosure. But in that, I'm just going to briefly mention a few pieces on disclosure quickly for you so that you've got a bit of a background to where I'm coming from with the accommodations piece. So there is no right or wrong time to disclose, is what I usually say. It's a very personal decision, and you can disclose when you're applying for jobs. You can disclose at the interview stage. You can disclose once you've received the job. You can disclose when you're on the job, or you can disclose at no point in time and keep that information to yourself. We know that research is identifying that disclosing does create higher levels of job satisfaction and potentially better retainment. So that means keeping your job longer, but it's a very individual choice. And a lot of people I work with do disclose for an interview, and a lot of people I work with do not disclose for an interview. So thinking to decide if you want to make sure that you are requesting accommodations for an interview, you really need to think about how do I interview? And am I somebody who can interview and answer questions in a way that I'm feeling comfortable and confident that I'm doing my best job? Or am I interviewing in a way that I know that I'm not presenting my best self in that moment and I am far more capable than what I am displaying in an interview? And if it's the latter, then certainly thinking about accommodations for an interview could be a good idea. So what that could look like would be asking for questions in advance. It could also look like inquiring about the number of people who one would be interviewing with and requesting a smaller panel. So I know that one time when I was applying for a job back at Old Navy, when I was quite a bit younger, it was a group interview and it was a panel interview. And it was the first that I'd ever had of that kind. But there's probably 3 or 4 other candidates interviewing at the same time as me, and there were 2 interviewers. So we were sitting in a circle of a group of 6 people. And I think I usually interview relatively comfortably. I like to talk, and I think that I've got okay social skills, pretty decent. And I think that I do well in interviews usually. But in that particular circumstance, I was really thrown off. I didn't know that it was going to be a group interview. I didn't know that there was going to be a small panel and I'd be amongst a group of 6. And I really didn't do very well that day. So I'm not saying that I would necessarily request accommodations myself in that situation in the future, but asking a few questions, at least to figure out the number of people, the style of interview, that will help you further identify if an accommodation for an interview could be a helpful thing or not. And if it is, then you could certainly request a smaller panel or request an individual interview, so opting out of group interviews. The other thing that a lot of people that I work with do, depending on the industry, is they request for the opportunity to demonstrate their skills versus just talking about their skills. So again, if it's in tech, they may request to do some coding or that sort of thing. If it's maybe an office administrative job, there could be the opportunity to do some proofreading or some editing or some demonstration of how someone might use Microsoft Office Suite, words per minute. It would be just requesting a little bit more of an emphasis on that. The other piece that's important to think about is also scheduling the interview for a time of day that's more optimal for sensory issues, possibly. So I know that a lot of people that I work with struggle in a lot of areas sensory-wise. So they might be quite happy to work for, let's say, one of the RBC offices downtown Toronto on King or that sort of thing. But if there's several thousand people in and out of a building and scents are overwhelming for them and sounds overwhelming for them, then just getting to and from the interview and being in the elevator with a lot of people, assuming this is, not the time of physical distancing, that can be really challenging. So I think that it's really important to make sure that you do have the interview at a time of day that's going to be the most optimal for you as well. And then another option is job trial. So if you think that even with accommodations that things are not going to go that well with your interviews, then a job trial where you would be showing what your skills are, potentially not getting paid though. I think that might be a good alternative as well to navigating through this challenging stage. So I've got a few questions coming in. I'm going to take a moment to have a look at these. Okay, so let's see here. Is there a specific place where we might find past webinars? Thank you. So that's a good question. Ola from Autism Ontario will help make sure I think right now it's available through the same link that you have when you are applying, when you are going to the register, but autismontario.com/programs, services, connect with us virtually. So registration links are on Autism Ontario's website. Next question, did I end up getting the job at Old Navy? Unfortunately not. I did work several other retail jobs after that, and the interviews were all one-on-one, and that was good, but I didn't get that particular job because I wasn't prepared in that moment, and it showed, I think. Okay, so if someone goes to an interview with so much stress, what should the person do? So certainly there's these accommodations that would be helpful. If you have any anxiety management tools as well, when you show up and you have a lot of stress, that can be really helpful too. So perhaps you are using like a deep breathing strategy before you go through the door. Another thing that you can do that I think is really helpful to do if you're choosing not to disclose is just kind of like acknowledge really upfront in the interview, shortly after you've met the interviewer. If you acknowledge, I get really nervous in interviews. I'm sorry if I made appear anxious or nervous at times, or it may take me an extra second to think about my response. So if if that's a situation, then definitely you can mention that. And I find a lot of times when people acknowledge what they feel like is the elephant in the room, it starts to make some of the stress and worry go away. So that might be another idea. Okay, so I have a comment from someone. They say, sometimes I feel like disclosing is like using a get out of jail free card. I don't like feeling like I need to disclose. So for that person, I would say, then perhaps it depends on, it's really, you need to assess, do you need to disclose at the interview stage or not? So for many, they don't disclose at the interview stage. Maybe it's disclosing at a later stage. It really depends. For the purpose of this conversation, it really depends on how you think you interview. So if you've had a lot of interviews that you haven't had success with in the past, or if you've ever got feedback that you didn't interview well, certainly spending some time working on your interview skills is a great thing to do. But also then I would definitely suggest that you think about that. Okay, so so then I have a question saying something about interview, what was the part about interviews requiring demonstration? So what I was saying there was that sometimes there's the opportunity to demonstrate skill as opposed to responding to questions about your skills verbally. There might be the opportunity for a job trial, or a test, or way to exemplify your skills during the interview. So that's what I was trying to say about that. So that's something to definitely look into. And certainly I think at the very minimum, asking about the format of the interview is really, really helpful. A great comment. I encourage my supported individuals to say, I need a moment to think, or similar when they need more processing time. So that's a really good tip coming in from someone. And I certainly would recommend doing something like that too. So mentioning that if you're getting nervous in the moment and you're taking some extra time to process the question, you can say something like, I need a moment to think. Another thing that I encourage clients to do a lot of the time is to repeat the question back to the interviewer. Or possibly even have a notebook with them and just say, I process best by writing a few things down. Let me just make a few notes here. And that will give them extra time to have a moment or two to process and to respond to the question. Sometimes that visual prompt of writing things down is good. So then I have, just trying to see what other questions I've got here coming through. Okay. So, in supporting someone who has done a job trial before, what did that look like? So certainly in some industries, so in the restaurant industry, I've supported individuals who might show up and say, instead of having an interview, I'm thinking of an example of someone in a dishwashing position. And as opposed to having an interview, or as opposed to having references checked, what basically happened instead was the employer said, let's give you a try for a day. And they showed up for a few hours, and that was arranged in advance. And then they went on to show their skills around dishwashing, communicating on the team, all those good pieces. And that's how they got the job. So that can happen. It's just a matter of, depending on the industry, depending on the communication with the employer. Okay, so I'm just trying to see if I've got through most of the questions. I'm glad that everybody's asking questions. This is good conversation, I hope. Okay. Okay, so if someone does not know the question that the person is asking you, how should the person explain it in a proper way? So if you're not understanding the question that's being asked of you, you could ask for the interviewer you could say to the interviewer, could you please reword that for me? Or you could explain how you are interpreting the question as well. So if I wasn't sure, I would say, I think you're asking about X. Is that correct? And then that gives a person the opportunity to go on and describe to them, yes, that's what I'm thinking about, or no, that's not what I'm thinking about. So that's what I would say about that. Okay. So I think we've got them all here. And then, do you recommend using an app like Notability that has a voiceover function to prepare their profiles? So I'm not quite sure what context that would mean. So if you've got more question or more context for that, then I can certainly respond to that one. Does that not risk hurting your employment prospects? I'm not sure, does what not risk hurting your employment prospects? Asking for accommodation? Maybe you can clarify a little bit more on that, and I'll pop back to those questions in a little while, okay? Thank you, everyone, for that great bit of discussion there. It's definitely a hot topic, the interview piece. Okay, so just being mindful of time, I'm going to move forward a little bit. And then there's a really good link that I have here, and it's also in the handouts. It's higherautism.org, and it's a good resource for interviewers who are actually interviewing someone with autism spectrum disorder, so they can go back and you can share that with a future interviewer potentially, or you could just look through it and think, is there anything else in there that could benefit me that an employer could do? All right. So communicating with your interviewer. So this is something that I spend a lot of time talking to people about. It's that moment or two before the interview has started, or that moment or two when the interview may have ended. And you're either walking down a hall together, you're sitting in a room briefly waiting for someone else to join, that sort of thing. It includes that moment where you walk through the doors, and maybe you're talking to an administrative staff person, letting them know that you're there. So basically the interview starts from the moment you show up on the property. You need to be in interview mode from that time onwards. So maybe not sitting in the waiting room and having conversations with friends, that sort of thing. It's really important to be present upon arrival. So handshaking at the beginning of the interview is a typical practice. If that's something that's not comfortable for you, certainly actually that whole piece is something that, as I'm saying it, I'm rethinking that maybe that won't be a common practice going forward in the future. But at this time in the past, I guess a couple months ago, that would have been typical practice, and it's questionable going forward. So maybe we'll table that one. But other things to do would be limiting small talk at the beginning of the interview, because your interviewer expects that you're probably nervous. So if you know that you're not that good at small talk, or it may be difficult for you, as opposed to pushing yourself to really work through that as well right before you're already going into a high stress situation, probably just limit it. Maybe try to offer a smile, that sort of thing instead. And as I mentioned before, acknowledging that interviews make you nervous, sometimes that can be a really helpful thing to do, just to kind of clear the air that, yeah, you are presenting nervous. Maybe you are having some nervous tics or that sort of thing in the moment, and that's okay. But you're just maybe acknowledging that so everybody knows, yeah, I am nervous. And then, of course, thanking the interviewer at the end is really important. And when we get there a little bit later on, I have a sample thank you at the end of the slides. Okay. So we know that there's a few different types of questions. There's general, quite common questions that we're going to go through. And then there's behavioral or situational questions that I'm going to give you a little bit of insight to as well, and an approach for those. And then there's the skill testing questions, and that's where it's specific to an industry. So some of the things I've mentioned already, like typing, speed, or demonstrating proficiency in certain software programs. Okay. So just a quick moment to focus on questions that are not okay to ask. So it's not okay to be asking, it's not okay if your interviewer asks you about where you're born, where you're from, place of origin or citizenship, anything about religion, anything about age, gender, race or ethnicity, family structure, mental health or physical health. Now, if you have disclosed quite directly, they may have questions, and that would be okay in that context. But if you haven't disclosed anything, it's not really okay for them to put you on the spot and ask you about health or mental health. Okay, and then it's illegal to ask about any appearance issues, height, weight, and pardoned offenses. So if there has been something pardoned in the past on not a part of your record, they can't really ask about that either. Okay, so some of the most common questions we're going to get into now include tell me about yourself, describing some strengths or skills, and talking about a weakness. So we're definitely going to make some time to get through all three of those today. And then I'm going to give you some insight on why you want to work here, how to respond to that question, how to be prepared, how to research. And then we're going to talk about a few more situational kinds of questions. So having a difficult time, a difficult situation, or conflict with a coworker, we're going to brush on that a little bit and try to help you understand what an employer will be looking for in a response there. Okay, so before we flip into those, I'm just going to double check on any more questions coming in. Let's see here. Okay. Oops. Okay. All right, so... All right, so we're going to come back to some of these in a little while then. Okay. So some common questions, and what we're looking at next is tell me about yourself. So we want to keep it professional, not your whole life story. Sharing about your most recent job and related education or your most related work. And you want to keep it to about 6 statements ideally. So what we're going to do, I'm going to try to do a screen share with you right now. And I'm hoping that you're going to be able to get the audio and get some information from someone responding to that question. This was at a local university from the Career Services Department, and the link's going to be available if you want to go back and watch it later, should there be any issues. But we're going to give it a try, and if there are any issues, then you're just going to hear me talking a little bit more. But I thought I'd break it up a little bit, give you a different voice to hear for a moment. So let's see what happens. Okay, so this is, okay, let's see here. So that's the link for later, and I'm going to try to share it. And this is a tell me about yourself example. So let's see how it goes.
I've been studying professional writing at Carnegie Mellon for the past 3 years. One of my biggest writing projects was I wrote a huge research paper about women's rights in Sudan, which sort of leads me to why I'm interested in your organization, because of all the social activism that your group is involved with and how you're very globally minded. That's something that really personally drew me to what you guys have been doing. In addition to my in addition to my academics, I've always been involved in a number of other activities. That includes, I was an RA, so resident assistant. I was in charge of a bunch of students, basically a whole floor of students. And in addition to sort of playing police officer with them and making sure they were safe, I also got to really be invested in their happiness and how much they enjoyed being at school. I also am an
Okay, so I'm going to pause it there and flip back so you can hear a little bit about how someone is sharing a bit about themselves. So I hope that worked. I've got no comments coming in that didn't, so that's a good thing. So anyways, and if you didn't get the chance to hear it, you might want to go back and look at that later. What I like about that video is if you do go to the link and you watch the whole thing, it shows a bit of a not so good example, and then it shows a better example. So in that example, that was a little bit more polished. In the first example that she practices, she uses a lot of acronyms that maybe her interviewer is not familiar with. So you see there, she said RA, and then she explained what an RA was. And then the first time too, she was talking a lot about travels that were not really related to the position. So maybe not really the most relevant for that particular job. This response is pretty focused, and she's not using a lot of words like or ah, which I may tend to do, but I try not to do it when I'm interviewing, certainly. And so you want to be aware of different types of speaking patterns that you may have. Okay, so moving forward a little bit, this is just a funny little precursor to talking about strengths. So certainly very inappropriate. So what are your strengths? I fall in love easily. Okay. What are your weaknesses? Those blue eyes of yours. So super inappropriate for a number of levels, but just trying to bring a smile to your face today because we are in the midst of some pretty heavy topics and pretty heavy times. Okay. So strengths. So what I want you to do with strengths is choose your most relevant and accurate strengths and the ones that are most related to the position. I'd encourage you to not select more than 5 strengths at a time for the interview. And what I would like to see you do is avoid just listing the strengths. I would really encourage you to add context to quantify those strengths wherever possible. So I think a lot of people miss that point, and that's the biggest thing. So you can be like a decent interviewer. You can be, interview relatively well and list that you're a hard worker and you're a quick learner. And those things are great. Those are good skills to have. But if you can't give some context to them and examples of how you are strong in those regards, then you're not interviewing as well as others might be, and you're not setting yourself apart the way that you could be. So I'm going to flip to the next slide and give some examples there. Okay. So strengths example. So my greatest strength is my writing skills. I can also work under tight deadlines. And then this person goes into an example. So they talk about a specific project and how they managed in that situation. So certainly I would say that wherever you can, if you can give examples of your strengths, please do so. And think about your strengths in advance and think about the example in advance. That's probably the best way to approach that. Okay, I'm going to flip back to questions for a moment and see if we have any questions about the last couple of things. Okay, just give me one sec here. All right, so I've got a few things coming in. Okay, so this was going just back a moment to handshake firmness. So I've shaken many hands. There's no way of knowing beforehand just how firm a handshake would be. What would your advice be? So honestly, if you're worried about your handshakes, I would try to practice with a few family members or friends and get used to people coming in with different levels of firmness. But I think that, and this is just a guess, but I imagine that handshakes are going to be a little bit of a non-issue for the coming months. I think that people will not be handshaking the way that they used to at all. So maybe we can kind of table that for a bit of time. And then asking for rewarding. Does asking for rewarding hurt your employment prospects? So if you're asking for rewarding, I absolutely do not think that would hurt your employment prospects at all for that interview, because it's just showing that you are asking for clarification and you're a good communicator. So you're showing that you're a good communicator because you're, as opposed to just kind of trying to guess what you're being asked and maybe coming across with the not as good of an answer as you may have had otherwise. You're asking for clarification. It's showing that you're engaged. It's showing that you're interested. It's showing that you're trying your best in the situation. So I think that's a good thing to do. Okay. So, let's see here. Yeah. So when answering a question, keep it short and to the facts. Someone's asking you if that's the best thing to do because they're a bit nervous and they have anxiety. So what I would say in those situations is try to anticipate what some of the common questions might be and try to keep it to the fact, but make sure you do have some examples of your skills to make sure that your answer is as strong as possible. Okay, so let's see what else we've got coming in. Okay, so I see that my screen's froze. I don't know if that's still the case. I'm just going to do a quick refresh here and make sure that we're okay. So give me one online in a second here, and you can see me. Let's hope. Thank you for letting me know that my screen's froze. I hope it didn't freeze for everybody, but either way, we are back up. Okay, so let's see here. So if you do not answer the question for the interview, does this affect the person when the person is interviewing? So I would say you do want to try your best to answer the questions, as most of the questions in the interview, if at all possible. And if not, then I would say that you would ask at the end if there, to have the question written down and maybe answer at a later point in time once you could have more reflection. Certainly, it is a good idea to answer all the questions if you can. If you don't have experience with it and you absolutely cannot answer the question, it's not relevant to you, then you do need to let the employer know that. Okay, so now I have another question coming in. All right, my son already has an entry-level job for a very large company. There are plenty of cross-training opportunities, so he could avoid the interview process and progress in his career. I have asked several of the autism support agencies to speak to the employer and advocate before the employer to provide cross-training. None was willing to help. I went to LinkedIn and contacted the general manager, who was delighted to help, and now the company is training my son on various positions. Why agencies are unwilling to help? So it's really hard for me to speak about other agencies, of course, but I think that the point that you are making around the opportunity that if you're already in a company to grow in that company, especially if it's a big company, is a beautiful thing to do. So thank you for sharing that positive experience that you ended up having with your son, having growth in the industry that he was in. For big companies, I often do encourage people to see about other opportunities once they're in. And I would say that certainly talking to human resources is a good thing. Certainly talking to if there's any diversity committees, if there's any kind of union involvement, it's always good to be connecting with people who are support people. It's difficult to say what happened with different agencies that you're reaching out for help in that position, because I'm not sure what their mandates are, those sorts of things. But I do know that a lot of times if people are already employed, it's harder for employment agencies to get in at that time. If they're already involved with a person when they're finding the work, then that's a bit of a different scenario. Generally, I would say wherever possible, if you are looking to move internally, and you have the self-advocacy skills to do so, then talking to somebody about how you make that movement and communicating on your own is even better than having mom or dad if you have that capacity to do so, because sometimes employers do get a bit confused when parents are getting involved. So I like the idea that this particular parent was saying they were trying to get an outside agency in. They probably were thinking, I don't want to get involved as a first person, because we know that generally moms and dads and other caregivers, it's typically not the best thing to be getting involved if you don't have to, because places of employment are professional places, so we don't want to bring in family dynamics. But wherever possible, self-advocacy is great. If you can talk to some people outside of work, figure out and strategize how to advocate for advancement and that sort of thing is always really great. Okay. So let's see here. All right, just trying to see if I've got all the questions here. Okay, so we're getting to weaknesses next. So using apps in an interview is another question that I'm hearing from. So using an app like Notability that has a voiceover function, so that can be appropriate as long as a person's really very knowledgeable about the technology. Another thing that I actually had a really creative individual I worked with a few years ago do was he ended up, this is a really, really cool way to interview. And what he did was he made a bit of essentially like a PowerPoint presentation, and he was in a design kind of animation background, so it really made sense, particularly in his industry. But one thing you can certainly do is to help describe your strengths, or to help describe a little bit about yourself. If you have access to some kind of presentation program or an app that you feel comfortable using, definitely putting together a brief presentation, 1 or 2 minutes, so their voice, visuals are always even better, to show a little bit about who you are. That's certainly an appropriate thing to do. So yeah, it's something to think about for sure. Okay, so I think I've got most of the questions for now. Do I practice interviews with my clients? So yeah, I certainly do practice interviews with some of my clients. Absolutely. Okay. And then can you speak to your experience with someone having a support person with them during the interview? So if someone's having a support person with them during an interview, generally they're engaged with a local employment agency or some kind of developmental service agency in their community. And typically if that's the case, then the employer that's interviewing them most often will have some experience and relationship. And it's been successful for some in the past, absolutely. It's just a matter of, if you're going to have somebody in the room with you, it needs to be communicated up front so that the employer is most prepared and that everybody's organized and ready to manage that. But it certainly can be helpful. Okay. So I'm thinking that we're going to pause from answering the questions for a moment again. I love that there's so many questions though. This is great. And we're going to get back into some of the slides, and we're going to talk now about the weakness one. Okay. So tell me about a weakness. This is a really important question to address because it can really turn things into, kind of negative. Weaknesses are not generally meant to be positive. So, but the last thing we want to be doing in an interview is focusing on negativity. We want to focus on strengths. We want you to be presenting your best self if possible, presenting your greatest achievements and talents. So the weakness question kind of throws things for a bit of a loop. So remembering that weaknesses can be turned into strengths is really important. I really believe that most people's greatest weaknesses are also their greatest strengths. It's just, it's a matter of appropriately kind of harnessing that and discussing it in a good way. So for the weakness here, what I would suggest is that you pick one weakness, unless your employer specifically asks for multiple weaknesses. I would say limit it to one. And you want to talk about the positive sides of it, if there is anything that's positive in that circumstance. And you would want to also talk about how you're working on that as a weakness. So if it could be a weakness in that particular job, then you want to talk about how you could manage that in that situation. So I have the example of, I have an example here. Taking time to make decisions may slow you down, but on the other hand, you're not impulsive. And maybe then you could add to that and say, I'm working on that by when I have a decision that needs to be made, I'm trying to write it out, take a few notes and really problem solve through it and give myself the time to problem solve through it so that I can address it in full right away, as opposed to maybe thinking about it for a longer period of time and then it takes too long for the decision to be made. Something like that. Okay, so moving forward a little bit. We're going to talk about why do you want this job. So this is just another bit of something to make you smile for a moment. This person doesn't want to be starving to death, and that's why they want that specific job, right? So sometimes the point of that is sometimes we're working in jobs that may not be our dream jobs. It may be a stepping stone. We may not know why we want to work somewhere. We just might need money. We may need a job. We may not know what we want to do down the road. So that makes the question hard and difficult to answer too. But some approach to that is research the company. If you've had a long-term interest in them, say so. If the location is significant, then definitely mention that as well. But we want to make sure that it's not the main reason, the only reason why you want to work there. You want to try to focus on what you will bring to the organization, not just what you're planning to get out of it. So that's a really important piece. So if you think that you can bring your knowledge on social media to the position, then you want to be stressing that versus just saying, I like it because it's maintaining a social media account from home. So that's easy. No, you'd stress, the talents that you might have and that may fit with that organization. And you can mention that you like the challenge. It's a chance to learn new things. These are some more general answers in this last point on the slide, but certainly those are a few pieces that you can share. Okay, so the next one is the next thing that we're going to talk about is the approach to how you can handle questions that are more behavioral or situational. And now, I'm not sure if many of you have ever heard of that type of question before and what it might mean, but what I will remind you of is there were some examples at the beginning, and those were questions that were, tell me about a time where you may have had conflict working on a team, or tell me about a time where you may have had a difficulty in communicating with others. So these are questions where there's often a challenge involved in the question, and the employer just asks you to tell them about that. But what they really want to know is how you worked through it, how you managed it. And one thing I'm just going to draw your attention to briefly is the STAR method. So I've got a slide here, but I'm just going to I can't bring it up right now. It's not working for my handouts, but in the handouts, I hope that it works for you. We'll double check that link that it does. But the STAR method, it's a 2-page document, and it's going to tell you about how to approach this in more detail than I am on this slide. And it's going to give you a bunch of sample questions that might be part of the commonly associated with behavioral or situational questions. Okay, so it does work on your end, so that's good. Okay, so what you're going to do is think about the STAR acronym. So the STAR acronym stands for situation, task, action, and result. Okay, so you're going to be talking a little bit about what the situation was briefly. And I want you thinking about these examples that you might have in advance of an interview. So it's always good to think about a situation or two where you had conflict in a work environment, because that's normal. Work environments are not perfect. It is normal to have a handful of conflict over time. So think back to those in advance of an interview. Think about what those situations were. Then I want you to think about what you had to do. So how did you assess what needed to be done in that situation? What was the task? What was the goal you're working towards? Then I want you to think about what your actions were to resolve that issue at all, and what the outcome was. What was the result at the end? So what I would suggest to do if you're preparing for interviews, if you're in that stage of your life, then to think of a few examples where you've had conflict at work and challenges. Write out 2 or 3 if you can, and write it into the situation, task, action, result categories. Just 1 or 2 statements for each. This will help you if you're long-winded, and it will also help you focus on the most important tasks. I had somebody who I worked with a few years ago, and they had about 12 or 13 different situations that they memorized and they brought in when we started working together. And that was how they wanted to address these behavioral or situational questions. And from there, we brought it right down to 2 or 3. We said, of these 13, let's stop using all that mental energy and have that clutter in your brain of trying to remember all these different circumstances. And we realized that just a couple of examples actually were quite applicable to the number of different questions that might be asked. So when you look through the questions in the STAR method handout, you're going to see that as you think of your examples, probably your couple of examples that you have are applicable to a number of the different questions. Now, just for timing purposes, because we've got a lot to get through, I'm not going to actually show you this link right now, but it's there for you to watch after, and that's going to be an example of somebody going through a difficult situation, and it's just another approach and strategy to addressing that kind of question. And here is an example of conflict that I'll read through to you. And basically the situation was, just brief. What you're seeing here is 2 statements. Or 1 statement actually. So I was working as a project manager on an IT tech project. And one technician was constantly late at finishing their tasks. So then what do? A task was that this person needed to talk to him directly about the situation before escalating it to management. So that shows that person's problem solving right there. It has them thinking about chain of command and how to share information. And then the action. So when they approached that person, they described that that person reacted defensively. So in turn, the person who's answering the interview question, they kept calm, acknowledged that deadlines were challenging, and talked about how they could help that person in the performance. And the outcome was after the meeting, they came to a resolution that alleviated that technician's workload. And the technician was grateful for that and delivered great work. So that's an example of how you might be able to do that. Okay, so on to the next one. Another really important component to an interview is asking the interviewer questions at the end. I'm not sure if many of you have done that or not. I know you've got lots of good questions here today for our discussion about interviews, but it also is important to bring questions to the interviewer at the end of the interview. And some of the questions that might be appropriate include, what are the next steps from here in the hiring process? That's a really great way to figure out what's coming next. When might I hear from you? What are some of the day-to-day responsibilities? If that hasn't been addressed already, that's a good way to get some more information there. What does mentorship look like for new hires? That's really, really great, especially in the autism community, a really good question to be asking, because mentorship can be even more meaningful for people who relate to ASD, because then you have the opportunity to have somebody who's there for you, helping you out, and someone separate who's kind of on your team besides just your management. And then another great question is, what does the training process look like? So we all learn differently. So trying to figure out what that might look like and starting to think ahead to possible accommodations that could be helpful for you, setting aside time in the future, those sorts of things are all really, really good. What other learning you could be doing in the meantime. So all those, there's a lot of follow-up questions and pieces that come from asking a few questions. And it shows the interviewer that you are very interested. Please don't ever, from here on going forward, and when you're asked if you have any questions at the end, respond that you do not have any questions. Definitely try to ask some questions if you can. Okay. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the thank you follow-up. So I had mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation that it's always good to offer a thank you and a follow-up at the end of the interview. I'm not sure if many of you have done it before. My guess is that probably many of you have not done it. I know that I never used to do it when I was starting to interview for different jobs, but now I certainly will always do it. And that's just a matter of sending a thank you for the person to take that time to interview you. Now, I've received them and I've worked with people who have sent them as like actual cards, which is beautiful and lovely thing to do, but probably not the best time efficient process to do, because we know that sometimes people make hiring decisions relatively quickly. So it might be better to send it as an email. So you'd address the interviewer, and it's always good to ask for the interviewer's contact information so you have their direct contact if you didn't have it already at the beginning of an interview. So when you're leaving, you want to make sure you have their contact so you can follow up. And that sometimes doesn't happen because sometimes it's the HR, the human resources, scheduling the interview, and then someone else interviews you and you don't maybe have their contact information. So wherever you can, ask for it. And then this is what you would do. So you're just thanking them for taking the time to meet with you, see the facility, and then you're going to briefly just give them a bit of a recap as to who you are, just a couple statements, not too much information, but just a tiny bit of a recap, because maybe they've interviewed 6 or 7 other people that day and maybe names are not their best thing and they've mixed up who's who. So that would be a good way to, differentiate yourself again. And then you would mention your excitement in that organization and that you're looking to hear from them and specify when, if they gave a date at all, and then you're going to sign off. So pretty simple, but a good way to make sure that you are standing out one last time at the very end. And like I said, a lot of people don't do it. So try to now make it your practice if you haven't done it before. So the last thing that we've got are some resources, but I'm going to go back to questions for a moment because I think that we probably have a few more here. So give me one moment here. Okay. All right. Okay, so here's a question about asking questions. So some have told me not to wait until the end to ask questions. What would your thoughts be? So I would say that general best practice is to wait until the end to ask questions. But if you had a question that you think would be answered relatively quickly, and it's a short question, it's not an elaborate, very detailed question, and if you're certain that your question is on topic, then go ahead and ask it during. But generally, it's good to leave most of the questions till the end, if that's a possible. That's best practice because, I'm speaking to a lot of people right now, and some people may have the ability to ask really on-topic questions and ask quick related questions. Others may struggle a little bit with that. So if that's the case, then it might be difficult to do that. I'm just going back to my last slide for a second as someone's asked me to do that. Okay, okay, a few more questions here. Let's see. Okay, lots coming in. All right, so I'm just going to scroll down here. Okay. I already did that one. Okay. If you do not answer the question, yeah, I've already answered that one. If you have no experience and it's your first, this is a good question. Okay. If you have no experience and it's your first time doing an interview, how can you make sure that you have a good interview? Very good question. So practice, practice, practice. And then I'm going to also address the fact that, okay, so maybe it's your first interview, or maybe what if you've had a large gap in your resume? How do you address that too? Because a lot of people that I work with are living with different mental health issues, or maybe their ASD has kept them from working in the past. So work gaps and first jobs are things I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about right now then. So if it's your first job, then you're thinking about your social communication experiences and experiences where you may have had success at school. So any group projects, you know how we're talking about the behavioral or situational based questions? You don't have to have had work in a professional paid for employment kind of job to be able to describe situations where you may have had conflict or difficulty working on a team. It's okay to reflect back on your professional, on your academic experiences or any teams or groups that you may have participated in for those kinds of examples. And then trying to focus on the other kinds of experiences you may have had. So maybe you're drawing upon volunteer experiences. That's always a good thing to do too. So I would say that if you haven't had a past job, think back to your other experiences. Anything that you can draw upon where you've used some of your wonderful skills is a very good thing to be doing. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention that reminded me that I wanted to mention around lack of experience or gaps in experience was, what do you do if you have not worked for a few years? So I work with a number of people who have maybe worked a little bit in the past, and then maybe their mental health got too big to allow them to work, or maybe their ASD was impacting the way that they worked, and maybe their confidence is low and they haven't worked for a while. And how do they account for those pieces? So I generally recommend that if you have an extended work gap and it's directly asked about, that you do address it relatively honestly. It's okay to, deal with mental health. That's a reality. We know that at least 1 in 4 people deal with mental health, right? It's a part of their lives. So if that's the case, then mentioning that maybe you were involved in some groups, that sort of thing, working on yourself for a bit of time, maybe doing, and maybe you do, when you're returning to work, take a course or that sort of thing to brush yourself up a little bit and to gain some more relevant recent experience to show that you're able to work again and that you're able to complete goals, those sorts of pieces. So we're almost out of time, but I just want to let you know that if you do have more questions, so we have a couple extra minutes that I can chat for. So feel free to keep asking questions for another moment or two if you do have a few, okay? And I do think I have a couple more coming in. So let me just see here. All right. So, okay. So do I Skype with clients when preparing for the interview? So I will Skype with clients. Well, I'll use an online platform to help clients when preparing for an interview. But also it's a good thing to think about what resources are in your community, because sometimes face-to-face for interview practice can take you even further. But it is certainly a possibility. And then I see a little bit of questions about a resume. And what I would suggest for anything resume related is last Monday, I was talking about resumes. So if you could go back and look at, the question, at the webinar on resumes, that might be a really good way to kind of get some context there. But you don't ever want to go back more than 10 years. You just want to list the most relevant content if you have more than 2 pages. Okay, so next question that I've got, let me just make sure I've got them all. If someone takes time to talk or they don't understand the question when they are interviewing and there is a group that is interviewing, what should the person do? So if someone takes time to talk and they don't understand. So again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, writing it down, asking for an extra moment, asking to have the question repeated, acknowledging that I'm a little bit nervous, and sometimes when I'm nervous, it takes me a little bit longer to process. That's totally okay to do. So try to buy time the best way that you can. One strategy that I always also encourage people to do is even buy time through like a bit of a grounding practice of taking a sip of water. So that just bought me a couple seconds there to think, right? So that might be helpful too. And it's pretty appropriate to bring a bottle of water into an interview for sure. I don't know so much about coffee, but that might be a good thing to do. Okay. And I just want to also mention that the slides are available in the handout section. So for anybody who's worried about different information, things that were on the slides, that sort of thing, they're all available. And there's a number of other handouts there as well that really give more context. So things like the STAR method that I maybe get into in as much detail. So that information is certainly available there too. In regards to dealing with the work gap, I didn't have a slide on that, right? But certainly I can provide some extra information on that. I can write down a little bit about what I said about that, and share that. But basically it's okay to acknowledge mental health. 1 in 4 people have mental health, and that's a low estimate in my opinion. It may help if you do take a long work gap that you are describing different courses and group supports, but you don't need to get too personal about what the mental health issues were or the health issues were, but just acknowledge that I was having some health or mental health issues during that period and I'm now dealing with it. I understand that someone else couldn't open the STAR handout either. So we'll double check that link for you and we will figure that out, okay? Because I had some trouble with that too myself. Okay, so another question. I contacted ODSP employment supports and was told by the agencies they won't look into other job opportunities other than retail because other employers won't hire people with disabilities. So again, I can't speak to that in much detail because I don't know what region, I don't know the specific situation at all. But my best guess around that would be that that is a very limited perspective and certainly not the case. There's people that relate to disabilities working in all kinds of different industries. And I would suggest that you maybe, if you have the confidence to re-engage or have somebody who, can help you advocate and follow up again, and talk to somebody different, that would probably be a really good idea because I would, if retail is not for you, and you don't want to limit yourself to retail, if you have different ambitions or you're not interested in retail, I would hope that that interaction does not deter you from reaching whatever your goals may be. I think that there are a lot of other options out there, and I hope that that door is not closed. Certainly it shouldn't be closed. So let's try to figure out how to reopen that. Okay, and trying to see if there's any other questions coming in. Okay. So if someone is nervous because they don't talk often, should the person practice before? Yes. So absolutely. One of the biggest takeaways I can suggest for today is practice, practice, practice. Practice with family, practice with friends. Videotape yourself doing it. Talk to yourself in the mirror practicing. Write down. So the one last thing that I don't know if I mentioned very much, but what I always do with people is I have them write down keywords. So maybe maybe we practice a few times and they, you know, have a handful of things that they want to say, and we practice, they keep saying the same things. That's good. Then we know that that's generally the response that they want to have. So what are the keywords within that? And if they write out the keywords, that usually helps them really memorize it a little bit more, but not get too stuck on that. Okay, so we're almost going to be wrapping up. We've got a minute or two more. Any other questions? I think I've got through them all, but any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, let's see here. Okay. Okay, so someone says, I'm a firm believer in fake it till you make it. So that's an interesting comment to share. Certainly, I probably believe in that too, right? But when it comes to interview skills, it may not feel super comfortable. So I'd say fake that you feel confident. That would be the fake it till you make it there. I would not suggest that you fake having skills that you don't have, because I think that will then come out when you're working later on. But I like that general sentiment too. Okay. Okay, so I'm thinking that so if anybody has any more questions, if there's anything specific, if they didn't get their points written down, certainly I'd suggest that you can email me. I think my email address, is it on the front? No, I think at the end of the presentation, let's see here. Just scanning through, there's my website, and you can, it is on the first slide. My contact information is on the first slide. So if you had specifics, I'm happy to respond via email, sarah.southey@redpathcenter.ca. Because I definitely want to make sure that everybody is feeling as supported as possible. Interviews are hard, and by being here today and participating in this webinar, certainly you're taking a great step to trying to empower yourselves and get some more great information. So I would like to, help you get as far as you can with that. So please don't hesitate to email if you had a question. Email is generally the best way to reach out to me, especially right now, because most of the time I'm chasing after 3 little children during the day. So phone's not always good at the moment, but email, I can certainly get back to you in a day or so. Okay. All right, so I think that seems like it for now. Again, past webinars can be found on the Autism Ontario website, so it might be good to tune into those if you had questions that were more fitting to resumes or that sort of thing. And otherwise, I will be back with you next Monday if you choose to tune into the Being Social at Work workshop, and primarily that's going to be on different scenarios that might happen at work, and also talking about how to manage, if you are working, how to manage working online at the moment and dealing with the social communication piece with a digital world that we are currently in. Okay, so thanks again for tuning in, and thank you to Autism Ontario for taking the time to organize this for us today. Take care.